health crisis, you go to your healthcare provider. If you're having a crisis of spirit, you go to your spiritual leader to get some answers.
Great. And I mean, that seems to be one way to, to actually address the response, the spiritual response, go to your spiritual leader. This could probably help you. But in general, what can be done to address these responses? So what's the standard of care? I mean, how do you deal with this?
Well, recognizing that there are people in diverse fields who can help people through challenging events. It's not always the therapist. As I said before, when I go into the corporate world and businesses and I help people, even schools and universities, help people to deal with challenging experiences, it's not all about bringing in the strangers with name tags and the red jackets. It's about helping people from the inside to be empowered with practical skills to be able to make a difference in the lives of others, to know what to say, to know what not to say. In fact, it's not often what we say that helps the most. It's often what we don't say that helps people the most. Just listening can be hugely helpful.
And can you actually provide some strategies for actually working with people who have suffered psychological injury? I mean, as attorneys, I mean, really anyone that's out there that's actually working with more than two people or one person, you're working with someone that most likely has dealt with a traumatic event at one point in their life. How do you deal with someone that when they're dealing in that situation? And how do you become aware and considerate of those kind of things?
It's a great point. Well, first of all, to recognize that you're not there in a therapeutic capacity. You're there as an attorney, as a counselor, in a legal sense. Certainly being aware of the feelings behind a person's words. While they may be conveying the facts, the fact that they may very much be hurting and experiencing some very real, as we're talking about, traumatic stress reactions is important. To really try to empathize with a person. I see that you're going through a really hard time, and I'm here with you. I'm not going to leave you, and I'll help you through this. Being honest with people, not making promises that you can't keep. But being realistic and honest and acknowledging. Sometimes one of the most powerful things you can say to a client is, it's okay not to be okay. And in fact, if you weren't experiencing the distress you're having right now, you really wouldn't be normal.
Right.
So normalizing and validating the experience of your client is really, really important. And finally, recognizing when it's beyond us, our ability as attorneys to be able to respond and deal with these kinds of feelings. When it gets to the point where a person is starting to present that they could be in some kind of danger to themselves or others, is substance abusing, is experiencing some ongoing debilitating problems with functioning, make appropriate referrals to providers in those other fields.
Interesting. One of the things that I'm really interested in also seeing is your relationship with the attorneys. I know that you work a lot with attorneys. I know that you've done cases and you've been in trials. Can you just take me through kind of where does this relationship begin and how does it I guess, manifest?
Well, there are some attorneys that I've had the privilege of working with on a regular basis, and we've become very dear friends, and we communicate, and they know when that type of case comes up, think about Lerner, so to speak.
Right.
But really, it's about empowering attorneys to know how to reach out to the mental health community, to know, as I said before, when you're dealing with a case that's particularly sensitive and it looks like a person's having difficulty with functioning, that I need to call in somebody who can offer some advice and guidance.
Right.
This way, it's also a matter of what you focus on as the attorney. You can focus on the facts and have somebody else deal with the intensity of emotion.
And as far as in the capacity of a forensic consultant or a forensic examiner, how does that relationship with the attorney begin, and is the client the one that's bringing you in? Is the attorney the one that's bringing you in? At what stage is the attorney usually bringing you in to do this kind of work? If you could just elaborate a little bit.
In almost all cases, it's the attorney contacting me or a colleague who reaches out to somebody in the mental health community and says, I need some guidance in either a consultation capacity, where I need you to review some mental health records, if you will, or possibly to potentially serve as an expert witness, whereby I would be in a position to evaluate that person, review the records, and ultimately, if necessary, go to court and testify.
And can you, without getting too specific into some of the cases, can you give me, I guess, one instance of a case where you worked on where you were actually testifying?
Well, I've had the privilege of working, as I said before, with both plaintiffs and defendants. I've also worked as, I have a case right now, somebody that's on an ongoing traumatic event, a family legal matter, where I'm the treating psychologist. So I'm not there as an expert witness, so to speak, or deemed as an expert by the eyes of the court. So different circumstances will require a different response, so to speak, from me in terms of what I do.
Right. And so as far as a treating psychologist is concerned, is it just you provide specific records that the court wants, or how does it from the treating psychologist?
Good question. As a treating professional, basically what I'm doing is I'm putting out on the table, of course, with the client's wishes, the sum and substance of what was done over the course of the therapy. This would include session notes, historical information, the intake records that I had on the client, what I did specifically in those sessions. Not only what did we talk about, but what I did to specifically help this person. How did the person respond to it?
And as the treating psychologist, you are the psychologist for the client, or are you the psychologist that's appointed by the court?
It could be both.
Okay.
In the capacity that I work in, it's often for the client, and I'm called in by the client's attorney.
Mm-hmm. And how do you deal with, the privilege of ensuring that, the correspondence and communication between you and the client is still maintained and there's still that privacy that's there while still being able to provide to the court for a specific case the information that's needed?
It's a great question. The right of privilege always rests with the client. Mm-hmm. But there's an understanding, and I certainly would get a release on this, that any time you're bringing me into your case, into a legal forum, you're waiving that right of privilege, and anything that I know about you, I will have to report in the legal forum.
Interesting. So do you actually have to get a release from the client in situations where the client and the attorney, the client's attorney, are looking to actually release this information to the court for their case? You're actually asking for a release every single time.
Yes, I am. There are certainly situations that occur where the court can compel me to come in and have to testify too, but I haven't been exposed to that kind of situation. It's typically the client or my patient very much wants me to go in and speak on their behalf about the nature of their treatment.
Interesting. And then as far as your relationship when you're not the treating psychologist, but your relationship with the attorney, is there any, I guess, from an attorney's perspective that's looking to actually employ someone to help them with this type of situation, do you have any suggestions as to the documentation? Are there contracts that you sign with the attorney? What kind of relationship do you have? Is it usually contractual? Is it usually just is it more just relaxed? I mean, how does it work exactly?
I learned very on with my work with attorneys that put the least amount you can in writing. So I tend to adhere to that. There are some basic information, though, that just an understanding of exactly what my role is so I can bring clarity to that so there's no misunderstanding what my purpose is in this particular matter.
Right.
It is different, though, as a treating professional versus being brought in as an expert, being deemed as an expert by federal rules in the eye of the court.
Right, right. Have you, do you have any, I guess, war stories when it comes to situations where you're trying to be deemed, or you're in a situation where you're being asked to be deemed as an expert and you've had trouble, or you've seen situations where that's kind of been a problem with like opposing counsel? I mean, I'm just interested to see the dynamic when you're actually, as an expert witness, what you're seeing there.
Fortunately, I haven't been exposed to that where in the process of having me approved, so to speak, as an expert, there was a major problem with it, typically based on my experience, knowledge, training, a federal rule, I think it's 702. I'm able to be admitted in the eyes of the court as an expert witness. So I imagine, though, that can be a problem, though, for some clinicians. And, from an attorney perspective, make sure you're dealing with somebody who really has an expertise in your area of need. For instance, I'm not an expert in family issues, in family law, and custody battles. So when I'm asked by attorneys, can you get involved in this custody matter, I pass on it, and I refer to somebody who can more appropriately handle that. My background more is with traumatic stress, people who've been exposed to overwhelming events in their lives.
But what if you're in a situation where there is a custody battle that involves involves a very important factor in the custody battle of one of the parents, let's say, experiencing a traumatic stress that actually influences what, where the child, let's say, goes. In those circumstances, would you still not be involved, or is that something that you would perhaps reconsider?
I probably wouldn't be involved as an expert. However, as I indicated before, there's an ongoing matter I'm dealing with right now with somebody that I'm working with, somebody whom I am treating, where I'll likely have to go back to court again to testify, which I've already done once.
Right,
and if necessary, I'll go back, but as testifying as the treating psychologist.
Interesting. And as far as whether you could, how can you suggest, I'm just going to switch gears a little bit, take a little bit away from the litigation spectrum and talk a little bit attorneys within their practice that are dealing not only with the health of their clients, but the health of their firm, and dealing with their coworkers, and dealing with ensuring that that they're creating a legal practice and an environment that's actually beneficial and takes into consideration. Is there some suggestions for that you can talk about a little bit?
Well, it's absolutely critical for attorneys to recognize that when you're working with people who've been hurt, you're going to be exposed to that hurt too, as I indicated before, and to recognize that it's going to impact your life, and to know that you're going to have to deal with that. And when it overwhelms you, or when you see it overwhelming an individual's ability to cope, you refer appropriately. How people respond during times of crisis is etched in our minds forever. When somebody goes to their attorney during a particularly emotional time in their life, they'll never forget what goes on in that attorney's office. To you, it may be another day at the office of hearing another war story.
Right.
But for that client, this is the first time I'm ever talking about that horrific accident that's left me with a traumatic brain injury.
Right. So
it's critical how you present yourself with empathy and warmth and genuineness.
And as far as that's very, very good for the client, but as far as how the attorney works with, let's say, their paralegal, or because at the end of the day, like you said, these are all people that are working on sometimes really crazy cases, which, like you had said before, sometimes we can actually experience traumatic stress not only from what we experience ourselves, but from other people's experiences. And specifically, when you're talking about attorneys that are dealing, let's say, in personal injury cases, where you're dealing with cases where people are really hurt, and they have a staff that's also dealing with that, and are seeing these clients come in. Is there any suggestions as far as wellness programs, things like that you would recommend for the law practice itself to help ensure that the people that are actually working to facilitate these kind of cases are not too affected by it?
Absolutely. Great point. It really comes down to a word that I'd like to use, debriefing. By debriefing, I mean, at the end of the day, let's sit around and talk about what we just went through or what we heard, particularly in matters that were particularly overwhelming to us. Years ago, I worked as a school psychologist early in my career, and we had a saying that anytime we dealt with a crisis in the schools, we would never leave the building without debriefing and dealing with our feelings. It's also important to make sure we're not missing anything. By being able to talk about what we've just heard that was so emotionally overwhelming and painful to even listen to, it could cloud our objectivity. So being able to share that and debrief with a colleague is very important too. And finally, the hidden victims, the family members of the attorneys. You go home after a very rough day at the office, recognize the potential to take this strain and stress out on those you love.
Interesting. And what about some suggestions as far as, what can an attorney really do as far as instituting? I know we have, these sessions where you can talk, although, and not to at all belittle how important that is, but attorneys are very, very busy. They want to get home afterwards. Is there any other type of, programs or something that you can suggest to law to practices and to managers of these practices that they can help facilitate that in a way that's, without them getting so involved and they're able to get home? I'm just being from a very practical standpoint. I know that attorneys, they're very busy, they want to get home. What can they do for their staff? What can they give to their staff, or where can they actually focus their staff so that their staff can make sure that they're still healthy and being well through these kind of processes?
You know, again, it comes down to what I said earlier, that in that golden hour during the earliest phases of traumatic exposure, whether it's for our client or in our listening and beginning to work with a client who's been through something very traumatic, it's not about therapy. It's not about counseling. It's about information, timely information, and providing support for people. So I think what we could do more in law firms is to really build in that informational and supportive component for each other.
Interesting. And as far as, just going to go backtrack a little bit to the different reactions that you discussed. You talked about emotional responses, cognitive responses, behavioral responses, physiological responses, and spiritual responses. Can you, in these situations, you've given us examples of these responses, but can you give us ways that for each of these kind of categories, the